Shooting it raw?
Yes, shooting it raw. Welcome to Shooting It Raw.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think if you want to talk about photography, you've come to the right place, because I've certainly always carried a camera with me for 50 years.
Maybe stay a little closer.
I just completed a 900-page book, which is on that screen for you. Like, why did I take all these pictures and what do they mean? And it's I've come to the conclusion that it's very much about our quest for identity. And so that first photograph that you have there is of a little village in Austria where a large part of my family is from, and I always like to quote Donald Rumsfeld, who call it old Europe. And he also used to say, "We don't know what we don't know." Mm-hmm. Those are two good quotes. That's definitely old Europe, and that's where we're from. And I've been there, and certainly my 900-page book starts with a watercolor painting that my grandfather made there later in life, because he was, as I am, nostalgic about that place.
Mm. So just so I can describe the image, it's in black and white. Your images are amazing. Do you mostly shoot black and white?
Nowadays, I've always shot sort of half and half, color and black and white. Nowadays, in the digital world, it's actually quite a challenge to get rid of the color. But certainly 99.9% of the book is black and white. So yes, I shoot black and white.
Right. So the image is a landscape of, so the title is The Illusion of Identity. And there's a bit of a dirt road leading up to a very plain-looking church-like edifice. It might not be a church, but it looks like there's a steeple, there's a cross at the top. Compositionally, it's very classically composed. The eye is drawn, from the road to these buildings, and there's like rolling hills on the right. And it's dated September 9th, 2020. Is it that recent?
No, that's the date of our meeting today.
Oh, well, right.
It is September 9th, 2020. But I'm sorry that I've stumbled into mentioning Eckhart Tolle's book, The Power of Now,
okay,
which has influenced me over the years, and one of the central premises of which is there is no time, there's only now.
I couldn't agree with you more.
We're good with September 9th.
Yeah.
But I think the takeaway, perhaps, from our meeting today, and it's great to see you as always, is that I think on a number of occasions in my life I've realized that it's really good and positive for people to enthusiastically engage their identity, be that, a narrative of writing stories. A funny thing happened. I hope this isn't
anything's good.
Protract too long.
Good.
I was teaching
teaching
architecture at Chinese University of all places, and the students were kind of a lot of them were from the mainland, and I know they were brilliant because they were kind of selected because they're brilliant, but they were kind of falling asleep. So I said, okay, here's what we're going to do. Let's forget about all the stuff that I was going to say. Next time, you guys come with a PowerPoint about yourselves. And that was new for them. Mm-hmm. They were like, whoa, no one's ever said that. Next week, they came with the most amazing PowerPoints. And we had this explosive class where everyone was shocking each other with the intense kind of differentiation of their personal identities. People were just happy to open up and open the closet.
Right.
It was just remarkable. And so I'm going to do the same. And that's what this book is about. It's just all about me, and I can't publish it because there's just so many details about people, some of whom I know would relish in suing me to kingdom come. But it won't be published. But, for example, this church is a good example. My great-grandfather was teaching there in the school. Unfortunately, his first wife, who was my great-grandmother, passed away at a very young age. So he married his maid, And they had children as well. And there's a photo of all of them together in the book. But anyway, my grandfather learned to play the organ in that church.
Oh, wow.
So there's a very strong, I guess because we are from Central Europe, old Europe, as Donald Rumsfeld said, Donnie, there's going to automatically be a connection to Catholicism, but also, as you know, the Jewish faith in a very strangely integrated way, reaching way back, probably all the way to Jerusalem. And so the organ is immediately, he learned to play the organ when he was 6, and that's immediately connected with Catholicism. He didn't really become a good Catholic until towards the end. You know, in Canada, the Jehovah's Witnesses used to come to our door in London, Ontario, where I was born, and they would say, "Hurry up, there's only 65,000 seats left in heaven." So I think he signed up for that, because towards the end they were very religious. But the story I really like is this about Catholicism, and with an Austrian heritage, I guess the theme here is diaspora. Every human being has a diaspora. In fact, nature has this entropic diaspora of coming from the famous saying, "In the beginning there was nothing, and then it blew up." Right. I mean, we're on that trajectory. So he learned to play the organ. But my favorite story, Catholicism, if you don't even need a magnifying glass. If you look at it, it's easy to be critical very quickly. And so the relatives were buried there.
Right. A
bunch of them, and they have wonderful stories, which I've documented for the children. In fact, our children were there when they were young. They thought it was creepy as hell.
Mm-hmm.
What, my great-grandfather's in the ground there? What are you talking about? But then we got to the point where the church was demanding 15,000 euros for every 5 years that our relatives lay there.
Wow.
And I said, done deal. But unfortunately, I was outranked by my father and my cousins, who said, "We're not giving the Catholic Church 15,000 euros. Forget it." So what happens? What happens in Europe? It's a rather macabre and fascinating. What do you call that? Ritual. They graduated to what's called the bone room.
Okay.
So it is. I mean, these are little stories that differentiate a person's identity. My grandfather learned to play the organ in that church when he was 6, and his bones are now in the basement underneath the organ. So that's just, there's diaspora within diaspora within diaspora.
Sure.
And it's quite interesting, and everyone has it. It's not just me. I mean, I think that's a cool story. Mm-hmm. Other people might say, "Oh, come on, Martin." But everyone has these stories, and especially in the mainland where people... we Westerners, we all have prejudices.
Right.
Amazing prejudices. For example, our countrymen were here defending Hong Kong, and just recently I watched this documentary about the attack in December of 1941, and the Canadian soldiers thought that because Japanese eyes were a little bit more, slitted, that they couldn't see at night. Which is just completely laughable. So of course the Japanese came over at night
and whipped their ass
and raised hell.
Yeah.
But the Japanese thought that the Canadians were effeminate and afraid to fight. The Canadians put on a pretty good fight, actually. There was quite a sacrifice made here. And whenever I'm hiking in these hills, I think of them. First of all, they're buried here, a mile away, and secondly, they fought here and suffered a terrible defeat.
Yeah. Well, so many little places to digress from, and this notion of diaspora, for example, with Poe, we're talking about with pressures on a community, and right now Hong Kongers being in Hong Kong, there is such pressure, and in a way, it's pushing a lot of people out, and it's creating. There's already a Hong Kong diaspora around the world. From, say, in 1997 when people moved away, or leading up to 1997, and coming from Canada, I grew up with now I think of them, they're like pretty prototypical Hong Kongers, and the kids I grew up with, I was like, oh yeah, those are obviously Hong Kongers. One of my ex-girlfriends was a Hong Konger, or her mother was a Hong Konger. So the notion of the diaspora, the Hong Kong diaspora now, beginning to coalesce, or to happen even greater the more that Hong Kong is repelling people. Yes, so I think different, and me being, born in Jerusalem and the whole, the Jewish diaspora, which is all that as well. I mean, I think you're definitely hitting onto something quite integral to human, because in a way where humans move. Like we're known as a species, we are a species that has kind of, immigrated and explored the world and all this stuff. So interesting that you link it back to, was it St. Georgian, Underklaus, Austria?
Yeah, Austria, yes.
Right. And where did I come from? Okay.
Well, that's under, there are 3 questions here. Uh-huh. Where did I come from? Who am I? And how do you recognize me? Those are the questions that go with the 3 images. But I'm very glad that you raised Jewish diaspora, and I have, it just depends how far back we go. I have a very close connection with Jerusalem. I had this funny experience where I was we're connected through James Bradbury, the director of the Pinacoteca di Brera Museum in Milan. And one of his good friends is Clive Britton. Right. And he's friends with Poe. That's Clive, how our connection goes back to the Brera. And in the Brera, there's a photo in my book of me standing in front of this painting of the crucifixion. And it was funny. When I used to go to Jerusalem on business. I had the privilege of working with these amazing architects in Tel Aviv. And I would always go straight to Jerusalem. And so often I would do a hero shot in front of this painting at the Brera, this magnificent painting of the crucifixion. The next day I'd be standing there in the same real spot in Jerusalem, which, it has such enormous symbolic meaning for so many people, and it has in the past. It's the foundation of Christianity and the Roman Empire and the Holy Roman Empire and Europa, as I call it. Yeah. But actually, when you're there, it's like the demolition site over there.
Of course.
It's a gravel pit.
Yeah, of course. And there's there's a corner store where you can buy yourself a popsicle.
Or a goat,
So that's one of the things that's amazing about Jerusalem, is that it's so, you walk around and it's steeped in this history, and it's very palpable. You definitely feel it. It's I would never live there. It's way too high strung, but yeah.
It's a huge subject. It's almost kind of like a bottomless pit, and I don't want to ignore. I'd like to go back to your question, which is a really good question. I am equally interested in the Chinese diaspora, which is what I would call it. It's probably the best story I have to tell, and it involves my mother, who was in public school in Vienna. And she met this a very rich Jewish child along with her sister. And they kind of adopted my mother and her sister, and they became friends for life to this day. They're very close friends, and I'm privileged to get copied on some of the emails. And not only do they have a story, one of the most profound books that I've ever read is The Hare with Amber Eyes, which talks about East meets West, Japan and France, and the whole history of modern art and Monet. And anyway, it's a must-read, and it's mainly the story about the Ephrussi family. And this family that my mother knew in Vienna were friends with the Ephrussis. They were larger than a historian has just spent 5 years writing their history, which I haven't seen yet, but I'm looking forward to it. It'll be some version of The Hare with Amber Eyes. She, for obvious reasons, they left for the United States via Paris in 1938. And later in life, she had a student called Bob Kwok, who she taught English, and she recommended him to my grandparents, all 4 of them. And he met his wife in Paris, and he was very influenced by this connection with Europe through my grandparents in Vienna. And he wrote a 1,000-page memoir of his life, which is basically a Chinese diaspora of a concubine who left China, and there's some generations in San Francisco, and then where we cross is this nexus point of my grandparents.
Sure.
And so Also, of course, Serena I met in Toronto, who their family had moved to Canada, amongst other things, I think to have a way out in case what's happening now in Hong Kong happened then when it was supposed to. And so that's how we met in architecture school. And then I've often said when I got married with Serena, I married Hong Kong and China. And we had 20 wonderful years here that included a lot of travel to China, which was incredibly inspiring.
Sure.
And there's a China section there with photographs that are...
In your book.
Yeah, in the book. They're largely in factories and other unsavory places in the shadows, which I'm very passionate about. We also lived in East Germany for a couple of years. There's a wonderful overlap between East Germany just as the wall came down with China 25 years ago, 30 years ago. We first went to China in 1985, which is about 35 years ago. And boy, has it changed. Sure. So when we talk about diaspora, because I've been thinking a lot about it lately, starting in a way with The Hair with Amber Eyes, it's layers and layers and layers of different diaspora, to the point that there isn't one. Certainly the Jewish one is the most celebrated, because in the culture there is this passion and need for knowledge and the recording and organization and retelling of knowledge. So it's a very well documented diaspora. But my friend Bob Kwok sadly passed away. He was able to put down easily 1,000 pages. I helped him because he wanted photographs of some of the art. My grandfather was a surgeon, but he painted, and Bob wanted photographs of the painting. And there's a page where I just took page 583 out of his book and glued it into my book. Right. And so there's that wonderful nexus of diaspora, which made it clear to me, even in my own life, that everyone is really, a lot of people are talking about diaspora, and it's layered into a kind of an infinite human story. Right. In fact, I've called the book One Life, Black and White, because they're black and white photographs. Sure. Originally, it was my life, but when I start to think about all of these stories and the universality of them, it very rapidly gets you to the version that all life is one. Okay. So that could take us to India.
Yeah, of course. Well, yeah, so the next photo, excellent segue, by the way. In this photograph, it's a very powerful one, which I know you told me was made in India. So it's essentially a girl who's begging. You're sitting in the driver's seat or the passenger seat, making a photo out of the car through the window, and she's holding on to the door at level with where the window comes out of the door. And behind her head is the celebrated mirror that says, objects in mirror are closer than they appear. And it's a very powerful image. How about you talk about, the fact that she's gesturing for food, but, which you write, the irony in the words in the mirror, which you didn't really notice until a week later looking at the photograph. So what's in this photo that really captures your...
Well, I think it was a beautiful moment because it was a very powerful connection between two people, her and me. I was at a conference, full disclosure. They provided a bodyguard, and we explored some truly unsavory areas in Mumbai. And he was driving and I was a passenger, but it was incredibly relaxed on a deep sort of Buddhist level, cliche as that may sound. It was completely peaceful. That's what she does all day long. By the way, she looked like she was getting enough to eat, but it's probably wrong to say that. It's symbolic of the fact that not everyone has enough to eat.
For sure.
And then it was just the sunlight being what it was, and warm, and no tension. It was a beautiful connection between two people. Slow motion, I would say. Yeah. And I had plenty of time to just take her picture. And then it wasn't until I wasn't looking at the mirror. When I got back to Hong Kong, I saw these words, objects are closer than they appear. And I thought, yeah, exactly. Right. Absolutely right. But then later, it also speaks to my sort of narcissistic view of the world. In fact, everything I've said is like, look at your own narrative that you're writing of your own identity, and that's a large part of your world, which is narcissistic, and that word came from Narcissus, who looked into the reflection in the water and fell in love with his own image to the point that he didn't even know if he was himself or his own image, which ties perfectly with Baudrillard. And we've been talking a lot about that as architects who blurred the line between simulation and reality to the point that now a lot of people are saying the simulation is the reality. Mm-hmm. So all of that is there in that reflection and in the whole kind of mirror experience. Right. I'm interested in symmetry. Nature is filled with nothing but broken symmetry. Sure. It doesn't actually make things perfectly, left and right. And so there is that element of imperfect narrative which fits our stories perfectly.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. On an aesthetic level, it's a powerful photo because of her expression, like the shape of her face. Like she has an arresting face. It's also she's holding up her hand, and it almost looks like a claw, right? So it's kind of the gesture that you can see as say an anthropologist or a primatologist might see as, a very kind of fundamental like gesture of give me food. So there's that, you have that rawness, you have the interplay of the reflection. I think, I'm
glad you picked up on that, because there's one more point that has been a theme in my recent thinking, which is that at the end of the day, we are a product of and part of nature. And nature, it's our entire universe, beautiful as it is and incomprehensible as it is. There are also, in terms of housekeeping, some unfortunate truths in nature. Mm-hmm. For example, the competitiveness. I was hiking yesterday. I hike here in the hills almost every day, and I was hiking, and these ants, hundreds of ants, were ripping apart a worm to eat it, and the poor worm was just, his number was up. Yeah, and that pervades nature. Yes, of course she has to eat, and if humans don't have enough food, you don't want to be there to see what happens. Nature has this imperative of survival of the fittest, even, and it's in the DNA. The whole kind of mating game about the DNA itself not being moralistic, taking away all morality from the DNA as a chemical event. Now, when I say chemical event, it has 10 to the 100th possible variations, which is a very large number. But nevertheless, it has its own imperatives that are profoundly influence our lives. We know that, and we kind of almost take it for granted. But yes, that's there in her face too. Sure. Maybe she did have enough to eat, but not everyone does. Yeah. And that's not a pretty picture.
Yeah, well, one of the ways that we can sort of cleave into our conversation, one of the people that I'm trying to get on the podcast is Richard Dawkins, right? Who wrote The Selfish Gene, and just that kind of echoes what you're just saying. There's also the idea of civilization. Here we are on the 12th floor. We're looking down at a very kind of industrial part of Hong Kong. And just behind, you see these super green hills. So all of that's, it's all the backdrop of our conversation. And yet I was reading a science writer who was talking about how even physics, even something as theoretical physics, is essentially biographical. I had Adrian Bejan on the podcast, and even
he said it.
Yeah. So you know what I mean? Like so it's there are all these echoes of the narcissism and the reflection, the perception here. One thing that the people don't know who are kind of discovering you through the podcast is that you're trained. Well, I love your personal history. So you, like me, are Canadian. You are older than me. You went through the Air Force. And in terms of your identity, one area of your identity is tied to jets and flying and being a pilot, which I find fascinating. And you also have this strong technical, tactile, mechanic appreciation that comes out in your work, in your photographic work, but you're also an architect. So let's segue from the photo of the girl. How does that feed the art that you make? So as a photographer, some of the photographs are classic, nice, beautiful snaps. But then collage, sculptural work that you have is just mind-blowing. And so if you're listening to the podcast, go online and see the image, the third image, which is called Glorious Control, because it is mind-blowing. So let's talk about that.
Thanks. Thanks for the kind intro. Yeah, I don't really know where to start with that. You're right to start with the jet engine. I love the jet engine. On the one hand, it's an incredibly simple idea. It was invented in parallel by the Germans and the British. The German one was far superior, and it creates this superhuman power. It's just amazing. 36,000 horsepower in your hand, which is used to fly around and fight with another guy who has one just like it, which is back to that nature, that basic instinct to prevail. And we could have a long conversation about the Cold War that we won't have. But certainly a lot of that technology that when I was in the Royal Canadian Air Force, we were in the middle of the Cold War. And so these jets were kind of weapons du jour. I think things have moved on by now, 40 years later. But, and that, I love that kind of ironic title, Glorious Control, which implies, of course, that we don't have that much control. It's all very subjective. It's hard to kind of sum it up in one succinct sentence, but basically that piece on the wall there is called J58, which is based on some photographs that I took of the J58 engine at the Duxford American Air Museum of the SR-71 engine, which is, we talked about low tech when you start up. It's actually reasonably low tech. It should be said on a more poetic level that aviation and jet engine technology is a nice follow-on from Adrian's talk, because it's all about fluid dynamics. It's one very simple idea that was first recorded by Bernoulli, which is that when, if you think about air as a bunch of particles, if a bunch of particles of air are going the same speed, but one has to go a little bit further, then there's a drop in pressure on that one. And that's a beautiful kind of law of nature, quote unquote. And that's the basis of all aviation and jet engines and sailboats. And it's a beautiful thing. And where it becomes profound is in boundary layer separation, even in one of the plug for one of the great Canadians, Anton Davies, who runs a wind tunnel consultancy in Guelph. And he said to me not that long ago that one of the things they cannot fully simulate on computers is the effect of wind, because they don't really know what's happening in the molecular level between the surface and the fluid. So air is actually a non-compressible fluid until supersonic. So that's just the basics of aviation and engine technology, that it has this poetic foundation in physics.
Yeah.
Most of it was discovered by the Germans in wind tunnels in the 1930s.
Let me ask you a very difficult question. What I would say is practically, a kind of question that if somebody had asked me, I wouldn't know where to begin. So in the third image, because it's a podcast and there's so much going on, describe what a person would see. So somebody who's listening to this while driving or whatever has a frame of reference to imagine if they were standing in front of a canvas or whatever, the light box, because it's printed, I guess, on light boxes. What does the eye perceive? So that is fairly easy. One of my favorite artists is Joseph Cornell. What you're really looking at is a Cornell box. We're in the Cornell building. And we're in the Cornell building. Yeah.
This,
so
in
good.
fact, is one giant Cornell box.
Okay.
And there are some other great artists in the building who are in different compartments of the box. So that is a Cornell box, and some of those details are actually my mother's dining room cabinet with some of my favorite objects placed in them. So when we're zooming in on this question of identity and our narrative of our identity, Cornell very rightly identified our attachment to objects, material objects, as helping us to define our identity. That's part of what he was doing, and that's what you see there is some of my favorite objects. So it looks complex, but it's actually quite simple. It's a lot of my favorite stuff. At the same time, now we're in this era of the codification of knowledge, and our friend Clive Britton is happy to talk about that because he's just written a book on the codification of music, and that is a very powerful language of the codification of knowledge because it's transferred over generations very profound individual and collective emotions like Mozart and Beethoven. There's something in that music, and we are now with our phones in the era where we are divesting large chunks of our knowledge to machines. So that's definitely a theme there as well. As there's the blur of our identity and the identity of the machine. And it's a playful, abstract blur. It's a kind of random association. It's not a textbook. And I think that's why I called this session today The Illusion of Identity, which is we make it up, but it's not written in stone.
Sure.
I have a colleague who's constantly making the reference to Moses' tablets, where things were written in stone.
Right.
Actually, it's myth, and nothing is written in stone, even in physics.
Well, yeah. So life is collage, sure. So just to give more of an anchor, so essentially, what it is you print very large. So it's roughly, I guess, 1 meter by almost 2 meters or 1.5 meters large.
Yeah.
It's in black and white and very rich, cool black and white, verging on a bit of cyan in the black and white. In this particular image, you have an impossible array of mechanical. You have like I can make out a kind of the display in a jet, various controls, cabinets, as you say, valves and tubing, and it's all metallic and overlaid or vaguely, very kind of ephemerally overlaid at the sort of the top third is this face where somebody wearing sunglasses. Is it you? Or
yes,
it is you. Okay, and it's
a self-portrait.
So this series, how many images in this series of these kinds of constructions?
So that's fairly easy to answer. We're picking up again from Baudrillard, the simulacra, the simulation. I also like quoting Bono, better than the real thing. Mm-hmm. And so these are, you asked about architecture earlier. I think for me, one of the main takeaways of architecture was that when I got in, we started to model everything in 3 dimensions. Mm-hmm. And now the entire industry has slowly but surely adopted 3-dimensional technologies so that the information about the built environment is a 3-dimensional representation. And if you go far enough with it, we're now talking about common data environment. And my friend Emilio at Bureau Happold, who says the data is the real thing. Okay. And that's all well and good. These things are real objects, and some of the nicer ones are animations from many objects. Like I make 3-dimensional mandalas that move. So all of this computer technology very easily can allow us to do explorations that are moving and that are rule-based increasingly, so we can accelerate the rate at which we innovate by codifying the rules of how dynamics work. And that is all partly in there because I did draw a lot of the stuff. A lot of that stuff on the wall is drawn in 3 dimensions on the computer and can move, and is most importantly is reflective. I love reflections, which goes back to the mirror. although I didn't see the mirror when I took that in the second photo, but someone once said of me, "Oh yeah, that's Martin. He likes shiny things." Mm-hmm. And it's true, because the whole narcissistic look. There's also the word druggy, which is that it is possible for people to alter neural synapse transmission. The way we see the world is a very fragile construct. Our eyes, one eye sees the world, and one side of the brain does the seeing part, and then the other side of the brain, in 0.7 of a second, tells a story about what that eye is seeing. Mm. But you can scramble that or distort it slightly, and then reality might be something else. And in the simulation, where all these variables can be managed in the computer, all of that is there. And so that's in the image too. So
you referenced the ghosts in the machine, right? So is that more of this idea that you have the tactile, physical, mechanical, and that what's overlaid or a residue of what's happening is consciousness, or is like what's your understanding of that part of the question?
Yeah, absolutely. We're certainly dancing back and forth across that line. What is real? What do we decide to be real? What do we call real? The nice thing about one of the things that I really like to do is to make very slow animations. We decided not to do it on this one, but where images dissolve into other images. Mm-hmm. And there's this beautiful moment of cognition when we understand what an image is. Mm. And that just shows how subjective the whole thing is. We're always defaulting to an image that we recognize, but actually the world can be a very tentative experience, really. And that's, again, why I said the illusion of identity. So these technologies and art in general allows people to comfortably take a safe departure with their seatbelts on from what they experience as their day-to-day reality and completely turn it upside down.
Mm. When you work as an architect, and if I were to look at your work as an architect, which often you don't have the freedom because of a client's needs, the boundaries of actually having to produce a tangible product or result at the end, can you cite examples of how this manifested in your architecture? It's pretty abstract.
Yeah, architecture is a pretty broad subject, and it can mean many things to many different people. The way my career played out is that I worked with a couple of well-known architects and spent a lot of time with them, Frank Gehry, Norman Foster, and Calatrava. But really, I think all of that work, what I was doing there, was very much three-dimensional kind of design and delivery in 3 dimensions. So really, for me, just from my experience, not to lecture what other architects might say, I think one of the main takeaways is that we are conceiving architecture more and more as a 3-dimensional construct in a computer, a virtual prototype. Mm-hmm. And that can then be output to machines that make it.
Right.
And there's an example, one project that I had some contact with, again, mentioning in Medio the second time at Bureau Happold, is the Morpheus project in Macau, City of Dreams hotel facade. That project was designed by the Zaha Hadid office, and they use this parametric technology to as one tool in a kind of generative architecture. And when the mainline Chinese contractor came to build it, he threw up his hands and said, it's impossible. And it was impossible. It was 1.5 million double curve pieces, no two the same. Mm. So some people that I was working with automated the generation of the fabrication information. So that's not drawings, it's the G code. It's what you tell the machines to make the stuff. And the machines made it perfectly to the point that it was installed to plus or minus 1 millimeter tolerance, which is impossible.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't exist in construction. And there were only 4 RFIs, requests for information from the site. Most buildings, your garden variety building, would have 18,000 RFIs. So this was an awakening. It was a moment of realizing that this information had the perfection of something made by a machine. It was machine-made information that was perfect.
Wow.
And that people couldn't make. So where I think things are going in architecture, it's not my idea, that's what my community is doing, is that part of the codification of knowledge is to tell machines how we want certain things done, and they're better at certain things than we are, and we are there's a word for that when you it was a word I was in officer training in the military, and there's a word for when you get someone else to do something. I forget what it is.
Like
but anyway,
delegate, you mean?
Yeah, delegate. That's the word. We are delegating to machines things that they do well.
Yeah.
And that, theoretically, I know people think, oh, is that going to replace us? No, it presents exponential new opportunities for innovation, because we can go to places that we couldn't normally go. It goes back to the jet aircraft.
Right.
You can fly 600 miles an hour on the surface of the 10 feet above the surface of the ocean. You can't do that without a jet.
Of course.
And similarly, the built environment, getting back to architecture, is now moving into a realm where the scale and complexity will integrate this machine capability for managing that amount of information.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a kind of a revolution to accelerate the rate at which we innovate. I mean, that's kind of what was happening in architecture for me.
Right. Do you buy into this idea that people have separate selves dependent on the context, right? So, for example, there's the self of you in a jet, and there's the self of you as an employee in an architectural firm. There's a self of you as an artist. How many languages do you speak?
2.5.
2.5.
German is my mother language.
Okay.
I speak English relatively well, and I mutilate the French language.
Okay. I feel like I'm a slightly different person depending on the language that I speak. So when I speak French, I'm a different person than I am when I speak Hebrew. And when I speak English, I'm, again, a very different person. In a way, the tools and the concepts and everything that I can tap into to express ideas shapes my thinking and therefore my behavior and whatever. Is there an analogy in that in terms of the different selves?
Absolutely. I mean, just having finished this 900-page book about basically all the people I met. Imagine remembering as many people you can that you met and writing a page about them. We are very much a product of the people we meet, mm-hmm. and our parents, our grandparents, our family. We're a product very much of our environment and our experiences, and that's why they're so beautiful. And they differentiate us. That's why we're not robots, because we have this spectacularly complex inheritance of experience, including DNA. And even, I've spent so much time with my mother talking about the inner workings of her mother. It's fascinating. And interestingly, I see a lot of that in our daughter. But you don't have to. You might. It's not a given. It's not a rubber stamp. But again, in the computer, it is the computer, ultimately inside the computer is mathematics. And we all know that mathematics is this beautiful tool we have for modeling the universe. I was using the morph command, which is quite simple, where one surface is turned by the computer into another surface. But what we're talking about a lot, my friends and I, is the mistakes, the misalignments, where things go wrong, mm-hmm. Because that is really just the emergence of a layer of complexity in nature. A good example from fluid dynamics is turbulence. When we were talking about the wing has this laminar flow, is the boundary layer separation. When that laminar flow turns into turbulence, there's not lift anymore, and you don't know what's happening. And they even in the F-104, they had little holes at the back of the wing that sucked in the air to delay boundary layer separation. And that was a huge military advantage. So all of these mathematical, I also love to quote Dennis Hopper in Apocalypse Now when he says, you can't get to the moon and to Mars with fractions, with numbers. And for example, the atom bomb, I was just saying, at the end of the day, notwithstanding Einstein's thinking and mathematics, at the end of the day, you just shoot a fistful of U-238 at another fistful of U-238, and kablooey, the power and glory of God emerges, a huge amount of energy. So it does get back to simulation and simulacrum, what's a simulation and what's real, but certainly the computer is a wonderfully seductive tool because it just accelerates. I mean, everyone's carrying around 50 billion transistors in their phone. That's just unbelievable. And it can accelerate the way at which we explore the world around us. And getting back to what you said, and really this sort of main subject of our talk today is identity, the complexity of identity, the infinite complexity of identity. Certainly all of those characteristics that you talk about and many more go up to make up our identity. Right. And so it could be difficult and overwhelming and overpowering if you overthought it. And right. I think most of us don't.
Right. One of the themes that emerges from the podcasts, at least, because it's based in photography and image making and discussing, is the role of memory. So here you have this book, you said 900 pages with all these images, with text. Memory is imperfect. So for example, in a previous or a future or whatever podcast, one conversation I had was with an old performance member with me, and we were a performance group, and he has all these photographs of a certain period of time, and he sent me the photograph, and it was really bizarre because I looked at that photo and I couldn't recognize my face, and I was sure that the female who was in the photo was my ex-girlfriend. And he's like, no, that's not your ex-girlfriend. That's not Janine. That's Victoria. And it's just like, are you sure? So then it was a competing, like, whose memory? Because this was like 20 years ago. And it was this competing, okay, so we're perceiving, we have the same photograph. I'll give it to him because my memory is a lot weaker because of my brain injury and all that stuff. But when you're going back to all these photographs, 900 pages, and you're constructing your identity, or reconstructing your identity, and how does imperfect and yet photographic in a way is a perfect record?
I think of it, it's a great question. I mean, I love the question. I'm probably living the question. The question is probably the story of my life and my identity. But it's a mnemonic. It triggers memories. But of course, we're rewriting, just like fundamentally our biological beings are rewriting reality for us every 7/10 of a second. There's a wonderful kind of quote unquote fact, which is that Michael Schumacher requires 7/10 of a second to take his foot from the gas to the brake. That's a magic number, kind of written in stone, if anything is. We're constantly writing a story of what reality is, and at the same time writing a story of what identity is. But of course, it could be anything. And people who say, "Oh, you create your own identity, your own destiny," yeah, we do. And so it's just a matter of how deeply you want to engage that and how you want to engage it. We are still a society, and we require cooperation with community to act as a group because it gives us a lot of support on many levels. But it could be anything. The sky's the limit. And in a way, that's why art continues to be so important. When I think of films like 2001, Stanley Kubrick, almost everything in that movie, at the time, I saw it when it came out in 1968, and it all seemed kind of impossible and amazing, and now it's old hat. So science fiction is basically, as we've all agreed, kind of just writing the not-so-distant future. And so I used to say in my lectures to students, be careful what you wish for. Our intuitions, our powerful intuitions about positive energy are very important. So I don't know. Did I answer your question?
It doesn't matter. I think what we're doing is we're ruminating, but it's also to see what kind of thought emerges. So talking about the illusion of identity, look at your 3 photographs, right? So on the one hand, it's this record of almost to like the roots, which is profoundly non-technological in a way. It's like this scene of sky and earth, not filled with houses. There's one church building, there may be a barn, there may be another building behind that, very serene. Jump to a photograph in India where it's essentially more mechanical. You're in a car coming into very close, intimate contact with this girl who is obviously poor and obviously separate from that technological access. And then the third image, which is this impossibly complex overlay and ghostly image of a man in this massive technical machine. So if we're talking about the illusion of identity, how do you wrap that up in terms of your story, in terms of your development?
I'm not sure that it ever gets wrapped up. I don't know. Listening to you sum up, I was thinking of Roland Barthes and mythologies. I think mythologies are these larger themes that we can latch onto. And I don't know why I was going to just end on Eckhart Tolle, who talks about presence with a capital P, meaning that there is this deeper, almost divine, if you will, essence within humanity. But of course, what I love about Tolle's book is that at the start of his book, he says, hey, look, these are just a bunch of words. And this presence, this essence that I'm talking about, you couldn't describe in words. And of course, even that is a mythology. Mm-hmm. So we operate on individual or collective mythologies, and all of these things plug in at one place or another.
Right. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining me, Randall Fancy, for this episode of Shooting It Raw. I really appreciate it. If you want to learn more about the show in general or today's guest in particular, be sure to check out the episode notes at www.shootingraw.com. That's shooting-it-raw.com. I appreciate everyone who takes some time out of their day to give Shooting It Raw a listen. So get out there, make amazing photos, and be sure to appreciate how amazing the world is. Gratitude